There was a woman who couldn't sleep, not because anything was wrong, not because her life was in crisis or her circumstances were unbearable. By every external measure, things were fine. She had a job, people who loved her, a bed that was warm, and a room that was quiet. But her mind wouldn't stop. It replayed a conversation from 3 days ago and found 17 things she should have said differently. It constructed elaborate futures where one small decision she made today unraveled into catastrophe 6 months from now. It asked the same unanswerable questions on a loop. Did I do the right thing? What do they think of me? What if I'm wrong? What if it all falls apart? And then asked them again, slightly differently, as if a different phrasing might finally produce an answer. She lay there at 2 in the morning, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, and thought, why can't I just stop? That woman is not unusual. That woman is most of us, maybe all of us at certain points in certain seasons of our lives. The thinking that was supposed to help us navigate the world had turned on itself. The same mind that could solve problems and plan beautifully and create and connect, that same mind had become the loudest, most relentless source of suffering in its own life, and nobody ever explained why. Nobody sat down with us and said, here is what overthinking actually is. Here is what it does to the brain and the body. Here is why the harder you try to stop it, the stronger it gets. And here, specifically, practically, honestly, is how you actually find your way through it. That's what this is. 10 stages, 10 distinct psychological patterns that make up the architecture of overthinking. What each one looks like from the inside, why it exists, and how, with genuine understanding rather than brute force, you can begin to loosen its grip, not by fighting your mind, but by finally, truly understanding it. Because the mind that overthinks is not a broken mind, it is a brilliant mind that was never taught how to rest. Let's begin. Stage 1. The misunderstood purpose. Overthinking doesn't begin as a problem, it begins as a solution. Somewhere in your history, and for most people this begins earlier than they realize, your mind learned that thinking ahead was the safest way to move through the world. If you could anticipate what might go wrong, you could prevent it. If you could rehearse every possible outcome, nothing could catch you completely off guard. If you could analyze a situation from every angle before committing to a response, you reduced the risk of getting it wrong. This was intelligent. This was adaptive. In the environments where most of us developed this pattern, it genuinely helped. The child who learned to read the room before speaking avoided punishment. The teenager who rehearsed conversations before having them avoided rejection. The young adult who planned every contingency before making a decision avoided the particular devastation of being blindsided. Overthinking was the armor the mind built to protect the person wearing it, and like all armor, it worked. Until the threat it was built for was no longer the primary threat, until the armor itself became the heaviest thing to carry. Understanding this, really sitting with this, changes everything about how you relate to your overthinking mind. It is not your enemy. It is not a malfunction. It is a protection mechanism that outlived its original purpose and doesn't yet know it's safe to stand down. You cannot fight your way out of overthinking. Every person who has tried to simply stop, who has gritted their teeth and told themselves to just think about something else, knows this. The resistance creates more noise, not less. The way through begins with something that feels counterintuitive: gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that this pattern developed because your mind was trying to keep you safe, and a gentle, firm communication back to it: you can rest now. I have other tools. I don't need the armor the way I once did. That shift in relationship, from frustration with your own mind to compassionate understanding of it, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the foundation that every other stage is built on. Stage 2. The loop. The defining feature of overthinking is not the thinking itself, it is the repetition. A thought arrives, you examine it, you reach no conclusion. The thought arrives again. You examine it again, slightly differently. You reach no conclusion. The thought arrives again. This is the loop, and it is one of the most exhausting experiences available to a human being, not because each individual pass through the thought is devastating, but because there is no exit. The mind keeps returning to the same unresolved material the way a tongue keeps returning to a sore tooth. Not because it enjoys the discomfort, because it hasn't finished processing. Here is what's actually happening neurologically. When the brain encounters something it perceives as unresolved, an unanswered question, an ambiguous social situation, an uncertain outcome, it flags that material as requiring continued attention. It keeps the file open, and an open file in the brain is an active one, pulling resources, demanding processing, refusing to be archived until it reaches some form of resolution. The problem is that most of what overthinkers ruminate on is genuinely unresolvable through thinking alone. Whether someone is upset with you cannot be determined by analyzing the conversation for the 47th time. Whether you made the right decision cannot be confirmed by running the same mental simulation again. What is going to happen tomorrow cannot be controlled by constructing elaborate scenarios tonight. The loop persists not because you're not thinking hard enough. It persists because you're trying to solve through thought something that thought cannot solve. Breaking the loop requires recognizing this moment, the moment when you realize you've been here before, that this exact thought has circled back, that another pass through it will produce the same result as the last 47 passes. And in that moment of recognition, choosing something different. Not suppression, not distraction, a genuine redirect toward either action, if action is available, or acceptance that this particular uncertainty cannot be resolved tonight, and that surviving the uncertainty is both possible and necessary. The loop breaks not when you find the answer, it breaks when you stop requiring one. Stage 3. The future that hasn't happened. One of the most common and most consuming forms of overthinking is catastrophizing, the mind's tendency to take a present uncertainty and project it forward into the worst possible future, then live inside that future as if it were already real. You send an email and don't hear back for 2 hours. By the time the response arrives, your mind has already constructed a detailed narrative in which the relationship is damaged, the opportunity is lost, and the consequences have rippled outward in ways that affect everything. The email response is fine. It was always going to be fine. But for 2 hours, your nervous system experienced the catastrophic future your mind constructed as if it were happening in real time. Your cortisol elevated. Your muscles tensed. Your sleep that night was slightly worse. For a future that never existed. This is the hidden cost of catastrophizing that rarely gets named. It is not just unpleasant, it is physiologically expensive. The body does not distinguish between a real threat and a vividly imagined one. Both activate the stress response, both cost something from the body's reserves. And people who catastrophize chronically are running their stress response on scenarios that have a remarkably low rate of actually occurring. Research consistently shows that the vast majority of what chronic overthinkers worry about never happens. And of the things that do happen, most are handled far more effectively in the moment than the pre-worry suggested they would be. The antidote to catastrophizing is not positive thinking. Forcing optimism onto a mind that is genuinely trying to prepare for risk doesn't work and doesn't last. The antidote is what some psychologists call decatastrophizing, a simple, honest practice of asking, what is the most likely outcome here, not the worst possible one? Not denying that bad outcomes exist, not pretending everything will definitely be fine, just gently, firmly redirecting the mind from the catastrophic extreme to the realistic middle ground. Most of the time, the realistic middle ground is manageable. Most of the time, you already know how to handle it. Your mind just needed permission to stop rehearsing the disaster and start trusting the person who would actually navigate whatever came. That person is you, and you are more capable than your worst-case scenarios suggest. Stage 4. The opinions that live in your head. There is a particular kind of overthinking that has nothing to do with events or outcomes. It has to do with people. Specifically, with what people think of you. It is the mental replay of a conversation where you said something slightly off and have since reconstructed what the other person's expression meant, what they were thinking, whether your relationship is subtly different now, whether they've mentioned it to anyone else. It is the pre-rehearsal of interactions that haven't happened yet, running through every possible way they could respond and preparing a response to each response 3 levels deep. It is the constant low-level monitoring of how you're being perceived, received, evaluated. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect, the deeply human tendency to overestimate how much attention other people are paying to us. And the research is both clear and quietly liberating. People are paying far less attention to you than you think. Not because you don't matter, but because they are largely occupied with the same thing you are, monitoring how they themselves are being perceived. Everyone is standing in their own spotlight, worried about their own performance, constructing their own narrative about how the conversation went. The mental bandwidth available for sustained critical analysis of you is genuinely much smaller than the part of your mind convinced it's enormous. This doesn't mean other people's perceptions are irrelevant. It means that the version of them living rent-free in your head, the one who has cataloged your every awkward moment and is holding them against you, is a fiction. A very convincing, very persistent fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. The practice here is radical in its simplicity. When you notice you're living inside someone else's hypothetical judgment, name it. Say to yourself, quietly and without drama, I am doing the thing again. I am putting words and thoughts into someone else's mind and then responding to those invented thoughts as if they are real. And then, gently, without force, let the imagined audience go. They have their own spotlights. They're not watching yours as closely as you think. Stage 5. The paralysis of too many thoughts. Overthinking doesn't just create anxiety, it creates paralysis. The mind that analyzes every option from every angle, that constructs the potential consequences of every possible choice, that refuses to commit to a direction until certainty is achieved, that mind eventually stops moving. Not because the person is lazy or indecisive by nature, but because the sheer cognitive weight of sustained overanalysis makes forward motion feel impossible. This is decision fatigue taken to its furthest expression. When every decision, from what to eat to whether to send that message to how to respond to a difficult conversation, requires a full internal tribunal, the mind exhausts itself before it ever arrives at action. And here is the painful irony. The longer the paralysis continues, the more the mind interprets the absence of action as evidence that the decision is genuinely too difficult, too risky, too consequential to make without more analysis. So it analyzes more and moves less. The way through paralysis is not more information. More information is almost never what's actually missing. What's missing is tolerance for uncertainty, the quiet internal permission to act without guarantees, to choose without knowing for certain that you're choosing correctly. Every person who has ever done anything meaningful has done it without certainty. Every relationship, every creative act, every decision that mattered was made with incomplete information and an imperfect map. The certainty you're waiting for before you move, it isn't coming. And the most important thing you can practice is not better analysis, but a slightly higher tolerance for the discomfort of not knowing. Move before you're ready. Decide before you're certain. Adjust as you go. The paralysis breaks not when the path becomes clear. It breaks when you decide that moving on an unclear path is better than standing still, waiting for one that isn't coming. Stage 6. The story you keep telling. Every chronic overthinker has a story. Not a story they tell other people necessarily, a story they tell themselves. A narrative that runs beneath the surface of daily life, quietly organizing the way they interpret everything that happens to them. The story usually sounds something like this: I am someone who gets things wrong. Or, people always leave eventually. Or, I am too much or not enough or fundamentally difficult to love. Or, the world is unpredictable and dangerous and the only way to stay safe is to stay vigilant. These stories are not random. They were written during real experiences by a younger version of you who was trying to make sense of something painful. They were the most logical conclusion available at the time from the evidence that existed then. But they were written then, and they are being read now, over and over in every new situation as if the old evidence still applies to the current moment. When you overthink a new relationship through the lens of every old relationship that hurt you, you're not reading the new relationship clearly. You're reading the old story onto a new page. When you catastrophize a professional situation through the lens of every past failure, you're not assessing the current situation accurately. You're letting an old narrative author the present. Recognizing your story, seeing it clearly, naming it honestly, is one of the most disorienting and most liberating things a person can do. Because once you can see the story as a story rather than as reality, something becomes possible that wasn't before. You can write a new one. Not by pretending the old experiences didn't happen, not by forcing false positivity over genuine pain, but by asking, with real curiosity, not accusation, is this story still true? Does the evidence from my life right now support it? Or am I applying a conclusion from a chapter that ended to a chapter that is only beginning? The story can change. It changes slowly, with patience, with new experiences that accumulate until they outweigh the old ones. But it begins with seeing it. And you can begin that today. Stage 7. The body paying the price. Overthinking is not a purely mental experience. By this stage in understanding it, that should come as no surprise. The mind and body are one system, and what the mind does relentlessly, the body registers completely. Chronic overthinking maintains the stress response in a state of near constant low-level activation. Cortisol stays elevated, the nervous system stays primed, muscles hold their tension. Sleep, particularly the deep restorative stages of sleep, gets disrupted because a mind running active processing loops at 2 in the morning is not a mind that can enter the stillness required for genuine rest. Over time, this has consequences. The fatigue that sleep doesn't fix, the tension that massage temporarily relieves but never fully clears, the digestive sensitivity that flares during periods of heightened rumination, the immune system that seems to falter precisely when you finally slow down enough to notice how depleted you actually are. None of this is coincidence. All of it is the body faithfully reporting the cost of what the mind has been doing. And here is something worth sitting with. The body can become an ally in breaking the overthinking cycle, rather than simply its casualty. When you move your body, genuinely, rhythmically, with enough intensity to require physical presence, the mind's capacity for ruminative loops temporarily decreases. Not because movement distracts you from your thoughts, but because physical engagement draws the nervous system into the present moment in a way that abstract thinking cannot access. A walk taken with full sensory attention to what is actually around you, the temperature of the air, the texture of the ground, the quality of the light, is not a distraction from your problems. It is a genuine interruption of the neurological pattern that keeps you circling them. The body knows how to be present. It only ever exists in the present. And when you inhabit it fully, even briefly, you borrow its presence for a mind that has been living everywhere except now. Stage 8. The practice of enough. There is a particular moment in the overthinking cycle that most people never learn to recognize. It is the moment when you have actually thought about something enough, when you have genuinely gathered the available information, when you have honestly considered the relevant perspectives, when you have done what thinking can do for this particular situation. And then, instead of recognizing that moment and stopping, you continue. Not because there is more useful thinking to be done, but because stopping feels like risk, like you might have missed something, like one more pass through the material might reveal the insight that makes everything certain. It almost never does, but the anxiety of stopping feels more dangerous than the exhaustion of continuing. Learning to recognize the moment of enough is a practice, not an insight. It develops over time, through repeated, gentle noticing. You learn the texture of productive thinking, when the mind is genuinely moving, generating, connecting. And you learn the texture of compulsive repetition, when the mind is covering the same ground for the 15th time, not because it expects new results, but because it doesn't know how to put the file down. When you notice the second texture, The practice is simple and difficult in equal measure. Close the file. Not forever, not with the pretense that the question doesn't matter. Just for now, just for tonight, with the honest acknowledgement that you have thought about this enough for today, that more thinking tonight will cost more than it will produce, and that the question will still be there tomorrow if it genuinely needs further attention. Most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time the morning brings a clarity that the late-night loop never could. Not because the situation changed, but because the exhausted, cortisol-flooded mind that was circling at midnight is genuinely less capable of clear thought than the rested mind that wakes to the same question with fresh resources. Give yourself permission to be done thinking for today. It is not laziness, it is wisdom. And it is a skill that, practiced consistently, gradually trains the mind to recognize its own limits and respect them. Stage 9. The return to now. Overthinking lives almost exclusively in two time zones, the past and the future. It replays what happened and analyzes what it meant. It projects what might happen and rehearses how to respond. It is almost never here, in the actual present moment, where life is actually occurring. And this is where the most practical and most profound interruption of overthinking becomes available. The present moment is the only place the overthinking mind cannot easily follow. Not because the present is always comfortable or easy or free of difficulty, but because the present is specific, sensory, immediate, and the ruminating mind operates in abstraction. It needs distance from the actual moment to construct its loops. Bring it fully into contact with right now, this breath, this sensation, this specific quality of light in this specific room, and the loop loses its grip, at least temporarily. This is what mindfulness actually is, beneath all the language that is accumulated around it. Not a relaxation technique, not an emptying of the mind, a deliberate, repeated return of attention to the present moment. Not because the past and future don't matter, but because this moment is the only one where anything can actually be done, felt, or changed. The practice is not complicated, it is just consistently, gently ignored in favor of more thinking. When you notice you've left the present, when you catch yourself deep in a replay of yesterday or a rehearsal of tomorrow, you don't need to judge it. You don't need to be frustrated with yourself for having drifted. You simply notice and return to the breath, to the body, to whatever is actually in front of you right now. And then you drift again and return again. This is not failure. This is the practice. The returning is the practice. Every single return, no matter how many times you've drifted before it, is the whole point. Over time, not immediately, not dramatically, but genuinely over time, the drifts become shorter, the returns become easier. The present moment becomes a place you can inhabit rather than a place you pass through on the way to the next thought. And in that inhabiting, something the overthinking mind has been searching for in all its loops and all its scenarios quietly arrives. Not certainty, not answers, just peace. The specific, unearned, available right now peace of a mind that has finally stopped running and simply arrived.
Stage 10. The freedom on the other side. There is a version of you that thinks without being consumed by thinking. That version isn't absent thoughts. It isn't some blank, perfectly calm state that exists outside of ordinary human experience. It is simply a version of you that has a different relationship with the thoughts that arise. One where thoughts are passing weather rather than permanent climate. Where a worried thought can be acknowledged without being followed down every corridor it opens. Where the mind can engage with difficulty without being swallowed by it. This is not a destination you arrive at and stay. It is a direction you practice moving in. And every stage you've moved through in understanding your overthinking, the recognition of where it came from, the naming of the loop, the decatastrophizing, the release of imagined audiences, the tolerance of uncertainty, the revision of old stories, the return to the body, the practice of enough, the return to now, all of it is movement in that direction. Freedom from overthinking is not the absence of hard thoughts. It is the presence of something steadier than the thoughts. A part of you that can observe the mental weather without becoming it. That can notice the loop beginning and choose not to follow it all the way down. That can sit with uncertainty without requiring resolution before it will allow you to rest. That part of you already exists. It has always existed. It is the part reading these words right now, recognizing something true in them, nodding quietly at something it already knew but needed to hear said out loud. You are not your thoughts. You are the one noticing them. And that distinction, small as it sounds, enormous as it is the beginning of everything. The woman who couldn't sleep, the one we began with, she didn't find a way to stop her mind permanently. She found something better. She found a way to be in her mind without being at its mercy. She learned slowly and imperfectly to hear the loop begin and say, I know what this is, I know where this goes, and tonight I'm choosing not to go there. Some nights she still goes there. Most people do. But she knows the way back now, and knowing the way back changes everything about how far you're willing to let yourself wander. You know the way back now too. If this gave you something, if even one stage felt like a light coming on in a room you'd been navigating in the dark, share it with someone who needs it. Someone lying awake right now in a loop that has no exit they can see. Like it if it reached you. Subscribe because there is more here, and it will find you at exactly the right time. Your mind was never your enemy. It was just waiting for someone to finally understand it. Now you do.